It's a pleasure to see everybody here. I am Sam Weiss-Evans. I'm the Associate Director for the Research at the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine and Society. We just call it the Center, which is where you are today. And we're very happy to host Jessica Weir here today. I will not be doing her introduction though. For that, I hand it over to Cleo Wolfson Erickson.
Welcome. I'm a salmon, a coho, and I'm headed up the Mokelumne River come fall. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jessica Weir and welcome her here all the way from the University of Western Sydney, far across the Pacific Ocean, here to my home waters. I hear you all drink them every day, out of faucets. Dr. Weir is a great lover of rivers, and of two rivers in particular, the warm, muddy Murray and Darling rivers. These rivers produce beautiful lakes that spread far across the landscape and hold many fishes, crayfish, and platypus. They have long been loved and protected by Indigenous traditional owners. Like my own Mokelumne home, these rivers have recently been blocked by dams, diverted to irrigate fields, and regulated so that their floods have dried almost to a trickle. In her lovely book, her very watery book, Murray River Country, Dr. Weir swims through the Murray-Darling's multi-species waters, charting controversies about how to manage them and how a group of traditional owners challenge the ecological concept of connectivity with that of cultural flows entangled with language, law, history, and culture. In this book, she writes, Indigenous people speak about water as a web of relations within which life, spirit, and the law are connected, whereas the moderns, that's you, have created a far narrower vision of water as a resource to be stored, regulated, and allocated for human consumption and economic production. This narrowing of vision by the moderns has been necessary to transform water into a legible phenomenon that can be measured and calculated by governments. My own home river has suffered from many losses as well, yet I also see new kinds of humans swimming in its waters, letting it flood, and taking into account Indigenous perspectives and even the experiences of beavers and salmon. Please join me in welcoming scholar and avid swimmer, Dr. Jessica Weir.
Thank you, Salmon. I've never been introduced by a salmon before, so thank you. Thanks, Cleo. What a wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone for coming here, and thanks to Sam and Deborah for supporting the talk today. I just want to acknowledge the First Nations of the country here that we're meeting today, and also the First Nations of the people who I work with back home in Australia. And just let you all know that my research is based on best practice research ethics. I have a research agreement with the Indigenous people that I work with and have permission to talk today. And I just also want to acknowledge before I get started that the title of this talk is actually taken from a paper that my friend Deborah Rose wrote. And this photo, to kick us off, this place is called Gundagai. It's in New South Wales, and that's an old bridge, a couple of old bridges actually, crossing the Murrumbidgee River floodplains. I really like this picture because you can see how dry it is. And this weather today is actually quite good for the talk because it's about drought. I didn't know it at the time, but I took this photo right at the very end of the drought. And it was a drought that went on for a decade, and it was record-breaking. As it began at the start of this century, it became known as the Millennium Drought. And it was a real crisis for us in this part of the world, in that part of the world. It was front page news. Because the river country, which includes the freshwater ecologies, the rural industries and towns, everything suffered from the absence of the rains. Water had to be shipped in to towns for drinking water. Farmers cut down really old fruit trees they could no longer keep alive. Grapevines were taken out, and so on. And in this photo you can see the arrival of the storm clouds. So the talk I'm going to give today is about this river country and the Indigenous people who know this country as their traditional homelands, and their responses to the effects of river regulation on this landscape and their culture. And Cleo's already given you a little taste of what's to come. I draw on the theoretical work that critiques the hyper-separation of nature and culture, and that engages with the agency of the more than human and what we can learn from situated knowledges, and brings us into discussion with Indigenous knowledge traditions and how Indigenous people negotiate their water issues within the framework of natural resource management that dominates water reform debates in Australia. So the place, this is, for those who don't know, this is the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. It's huge. It's our largest interconnected river basin, where rivers flow inland from coastal mountain ranges. So the mountains are all along here, and the rivers flow down. It's very arid from about here onwards. Very flat country. The Darling River is just under 1,000 miles long, and the Murray River is 1,500 miles. And about 2 million people live here, including 70,000 Indigenous people. And this is a map of the people who I had the research agreement with for this work. So there's many different Indigenous groups in this area, but these are just the groups that I was working with. They've formed an alliance along the Murray River and the Lower Darling. And here's some photos. The alliance is called the Murray Lower Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations. That's a photo from one of the Mildred meetings, and there's they were doing some campaign work with environmental community organisations. That's signing a memorandum of understanding with the government here, and that's at a workshop. So well, I think the common term over here is First Nations, but in Australia we usually say traditional owners of country, and it's traditional owners is a limited term. I'm aware of the limitations, but it's widely used by mostly everyone. And country is a term we all use to generally describe the traditional homelands of the traditional owners. So the inland rivers, they've got incredible variability, cycles of flood and drought. It's very high on a world scale, and this variability is central to the life that the rivers sustain. And so fish will spawn when the floodwaters come, and birds also wait for the floodwaters to make and stay in their nests according to the timing and the length of the floods. This is a river red gum that lives next to the rivers, and this tree will shed its leaves during drought and then regenerate after the floods. In the 20th century, river variability was regulated to provide what was intended to be a more reliable water supply, mainly for the agricultural industry. And large water storages were built to store water, to store winter rain for summer crops. And now this area has become our agricultural heartland and provides 40% of our agricultural product. There's some emus in a grain field. Oops. New water geographies are entangled with the old ones. New lives, new towns, new things to grow and eat. But river connectivity has been severely affected on an immense scale. So we have, this is a former floodplain. So the rivers disconnected from their floodplains because they're not getting the flow of water going out. So everything just dies. And then also where water is stored, this is a drowned river red gum forest. It's actually currently underwater again. This has been quite a profound change, the reversal of the seasonal flow of water. So it's really affected the way animals and plants live and fish. And here's some of the environmental repair work that's now going on. This was in the middle of that drought I was talking about, and these tubes were put down to try and bring some of because the river level is so low now, try and bring it up and out onto the former floodplains to create what's called an environmental flow. You can sort of see how the scale of what's necessary is dwarfed by what's being done. I mean the other way around, sorry. Okay, Bottlebeen Lagoon. This place is right next to the birthplace of irrigated agriculture, Mildura, along the Murray River. This is an example of some of the ecological disorder we have along the rivers. This lagoon used to be sustained by runoff irrigation water, but in the 1990s it was decided that we'd put that water into the Murray River to reduce salinity levels there, and as a consequence within a year this wetland became saltier than seawater and is completely destroyed, as you can see. There was an ecologist this was actually his fieldwork site, who watched it become decimated, and it's had a incredible effect on the birds, plants, animals, fish, insects, microbes and so on. You can see that there's very little life here, and yet these waterholes such as this are crucial for surviving out in this very arid country. And this is probably the most profound example of river dysfunction. It's, these are waterholes that have become toxic. They were used as semi-permanent water storages when the water was released during that large drought. The acid sulfate soils, when they were exposed to oxygen, they became more toxic than battery acid. So I went to this one called Bottlebeen Lagoon, and it was part of a workshop, and we had a field guide who said, who warned us not to touch the water. So this has actually gone from something that sustains life to something that's now harmful, quite harmful. And if there was a large flood today, the toxic mix, which is Bottlebeen Lagoon and Bottlebeen Lagoon, would be washed out into adjacent wetlands, creeks and rivers, and the flow of water that used to pulse nutrients and energy through the landscape would instead become a deadly flow that doesn't give life, but as environmental humanities scholar Debbie Rose says, would instead be a double death, a death that destroys life-sustaining connections. And these environmental this ecological disorder has had a profound effect on the traditional owners, on their ways of life and their homelands, their country. So moving to that now, this is a photo of, in the blue t-shirt, Yoda Yoda Elder Henry Atkinson, in the middle Muddy Elder Mary Pappen, and Wiradjuri Elder Uncle Ramsay, and we're on a picnic up in the Snowy Mountains, so near the headwaters of the Murray. And this is Uncle Ramsay's country, Wiradjuri country. When he was a young man, he worked on the roads that were built to go up to the dams. And these dams have drowned important meeting places where his people used to gather annually to feast on bogong moths that hibernate in the mountains. And all along the edge of the dam shoreline, you can see the stone tools washed up. Following the river downstream, we go to Uncle Henry's country, Yoda Yoda country, and he told me about how during the Great Depression he lived off the land with his father and grandfather, making a living out of fishing for native fish, mussels, Murray crayfish and turtles. Now this is just simply not possible any longer because those creatures just aren't there in substantive enough numbers. Downstream again, we get to Auntie Mary's country, and she feels profound loss around how she cannot take her children and grandchildren out to collect bush tucker because the little creeks that used to flood up now and then, which were the best places for bush tucker, no longer do so. So she cannot pass on her knowledge of country on country through active practice as she was taught. Further downstream, the Murray River broadens and gets cliffs. This is in South Australia, and here Ngarrindjeri elder Agnes Rigney spoke to me about how she directly links the loss of river life to the loss of cultural living. She spoke to me, she said, "I remember as a kid growing up how clear the river was, the water was, and our father made us spears from bamboo. We used to walk down to the river and spear fish, and it's just sad what's happened to it now. That was a part of the cultural living connected to the river that we can't really practice anymore." And you can see the water, this is the air around the area she's talking about. This is not clear water anymore, so you wouldn't be able to go spear fishing. And anyway, the native fish have been overwhelmed by the plague species that introduce carp. Right down, further downstream, we come down to where the Murray River meets the sea, the Southern Ocean, and behind the river mouth there are lakes where fresh and salt water mix. This is Ngarrindjeri elder Uncle Matt Rigney. He told me his people's story about how the Murray River and the Murray cod were co-created by the ancestral being Ngarrindjeri, and how the purpose of this creation was to sustain life, and how it is his responsibility as a Ngarrindjeri man to ensure that this life continues. At this time, during the drought, the Murray River had 2 sand dredges operating around the clock to keep the river mouth open to the sea. Matt Rigney reflected on the poor water health. As he said, "Now I look at it and I see a rubbish tip. Just surviving, that's it. You can't drink it, you can't swim in it because you'd be too scared because of the blue-green algae," which, if you don't know, it's a toxic algae. So this ecological loss is vast in the range of life that's been destroyed, the short time frame that's occurred, and the geographical extent of this destruction, changing the relationships held between people, places, plants, animals, rocks, rivers, and so on. Because country, ecology, and culture are bound together, ecological losses reverberate through practice, rupturing connections passed down from ancestors and ancestral creators, not just between traditional owners and their country, but extending out to include relationships between countries and between traditional owner groups up and down the rivers. I want to now turn to talk about the intercultural translation space. So, Australia is an intercultural society in which Indigenous and other people negotiate similarity and difference. In the Murray-Darling Basin, the traditional owners necessarily negotiate their own space within government institutions, laws and policies, and the European and other knowledge traditions that heavily influence these institutions. So at the time of colonisation, Indigenous people had their own knowledge traditions that had been developing with very little interaction with Europeans. But today, these philosophies and knowledges are deeply engaged with the knowledge practices that dominate Australian society and institutions. However, traditional owners continue to articulate their concerns about the Murray River in a way that requires other thinkers to examine their assumptions. And I'll just give an example of this. I was privy to a conversation between Wamba Wamba elder Jeanette Crew, who's here, and Yoda Yoda woman Monica Morgan, when they asked each other when was it that they first realised natural resource management was not caring for country. Now, natural resource management is a catchphrase we have in Australia that loosely describes government-sponsored land and water activities that support river function and so on. And caring for country is a catchphrase that Indigenous people use to describe their activities to look after country. Both Jeanette and Monica had been participating in government meetings and consultations to support river health. And whilst all parties were speaking English, Jeanette and Monica realised that there were profoundly different assumptions behind the terms being used. Monica recalled how she learnt that when she went to work for the government in Canberra, she learnt that natural resource management actually meant, in her interpretation, controlling resources for the irrigators. This is supported by environmental historian Libby Roben, who has analysed how identifying nature as natural resources transforms nature from its ecological context into an economic context. Jeanette recalled a water management meeting in which she asked other participants whether they thought natural resource management was a good thing. The response was silence. Examining the merit of the term was an unexpected question. Because in discussions about river health in the Murray-Darling Basin, natural resource management is presumed to be culturally neutral, a statement of fact rather than an approach to be interrogated. Indeed, the term natural resources has been repeated so often and with such authority that it seems to many that this is just a way of understanding nature, is just naming reality. That is, the natural resources have always existed prior to any such representation as such. However, a number of conceptual strategies are needed in order to do so. And here I want to draw on theorists from environmental humanities and science and technology studies, such as Val Plumwood, Freya Matthews, Bruno Latour, Timothy Mitchell, Donna Haraway, James Scott, Deborah Bird Rose, and others. These scholars have examined how knowledge practices from the Enlightenment that have argued in favour of reason as a basis of authority. These scholars have analysed how the arguments that knowledge should be based on science, reason and rationality rather than religion, intuition and emotion. And many Enlightenment thinkers sought to establish science and reason as the foundation of knowledge and thus free the world from superstition and religious beliefs. At the same time, a mechanistic view of the world was developed that had a reductionist view of nature, nature as matter and humans as the only creatures capable of thought, reason and agency. As part of this, the Western tradition of dualism was amplified. In dualism, two fundamental concepts exist in opposition to each other, forming binary pairs. The problem with these categories is not that the distinctions are identified, but that they are organised into binary pairs that are hyper-extended into oppositional relationships, set up in oppositional corners with a tension that cannot be resolved. For example, what is nature cannot be culture, what is male cannot be female, and so on. Val Plumwood called this hyper-separation, and Bruno Latour calls this hyper-incommensurability. And then the binaries get paired up in different ways. If humans are rational, then nature is mindless. If humans are active, then nature is passive. Critically, as Plumwood has argued, critical has been the separation of nature and culture, and society and nature, with nature as subordinate, so that there is no need to account for ethical relationships between humans and the rest of nature. As Latour says, this makes it possible to mobilise the Earth's resources without accounting for the delicate web of relations between all manner of things and people. So we can just see with natural resources, as Cleo was saying before, that we needed the construction of nature as natural resources, so abstract, legible, separate phenomena that you can measure and calculate. And natural resource management, that's where you get the humans are involved, centrally managed often by nation states. And James Scott and Timothy Mitchell have both written about this. Resources for the nation, no consideration of ethical consequences, and humans intervene and exert control over a static nature. As Plumwood has written, the result is a highly flawed perspective which both increases human power to transform nature and limits human capacity to respond to ecological devastation. We lose our ability to see nature in ethical terms and get an illusionary sense of autonomy. By characterising nature as lacking human attributes, that is mind, rationality, spirit, or the outward expression of these in language and communication, we can deny our dependency on this subordinate or alien other, and are indeed in denial of our very dependency on nature for survival. The storing, control and regulation of water in the Murray-Darling Basin has been possible by thinking of water as externally constituted and uniform, abstract resource, rather than engaging with it as the meaningful, connected and critical life force that it is. River water, rainwater, groundwater, floodwaters, cold mountain stream water, brackish lagoon water, water slowly seeping into a wetland or rushing down a waterfall. It's all the same when measured as gigalitres. As a resource, the meaning of water is only understood in quantities for human consumption, and with repetition, these narrow understandings become normalised. Other meanings are erased and difficult to lobby for within the presumed universal knowledge framework. And just to give you some sense of that, here's an interactive map of the Murray River system as a large plumbing project. So this is quite an extreme characterisation of the Murray River, but it gives you an idea of what an abstract technical approach to the Murray River looks like. This is used to help coordinate river operations by Murray River Water. They have a very complex weirs and dams, that many of which are remotely operated, and are very important in terms of managing water flows throughout the river system. But of course, not everyone thinks like that, and the Murray-Darling Basin, just to give you authority, just to give you another image coming from, you know, a sister organisation. This is a flora and fauna map of the Murray-Darling Basin, so I just don't want to over-characterise what the government is doing, because of course it's incredibly diverse, and both these images of the Murray-Darling Basin come from the authorities. This is a photo taken from Rauken, which is the former Aboriginal mission down at the Murray mouth. This is looking at Lake Alexandrina, and this is they used to wash the fleeces from sheep here, but the water's too salty for that now, and also it's done in a different place, I imagine. I want to explore now in more detail, just to contrast, sort of setting up two contrasting knowledge traditions here, just to make some points. But of course, you know, it's much more, the knowledges are much more interrelated than how I present them today. I want to explore now in more detail the Indigenous philosophy of country and what it offers us with the challenges facing the Murray River. When I began my research along the Murray River, I was initially interested in the tension between Indigenous and environmental issues, and I was really interested in how we could bring social justice and ecological justice into conversation with each other. And I'd probably say that I was starting off more from a social justice, definitely more from a social justice standpoint. And this was at a time when the drought had brought competing and aligning interests in water allocations into sharp focus. And national water reform was underway to set a new balance between different water users, with more water reserved for river health, and also recognising for the first time Indigenous water issues and water rights. Different groups were positioning themselves to secure access at this time to the highly valuable, highly degraded water resources. And so when I did my fieldwork, I had very broad interview questions. What have you seen happen here? What would you like to see happen here? And I was expecting a lot of responses to be around the water rights debate. But the vast majority of responses I got were about country. Country as a place, a practice, a source of knowledge and ethos for living, and how country was being affected by water management. The rights Indigenous people seek, such as going hunting and fishing without a licence or an amount of water, are pendant on healthy country for their meaning and content. For example, what use are fishing rights when the fish are absent or unhealthy? So just as I said before, country is a term used to describe the traditional homelands of Australia's Indigenous people. This is a map created by David Horton of Indigenous language groups in Australia. It's not quite, it's a bit contested, as you can imagine, and also language groups and country are not necessarily the same thing, but it gives you an idea of the diversity of Indigenous peoples in Australia, and these are not dialects. Each colour is a different language group. And if you're a traditional owner of country, you don't just have one country. You would have like your mother's country, your father's country. You have multiple affiliations. Some of these affiliations are regional, as you can see here. And then there's also, for example, connections across the continent, such as songlines are quite well known. Songlines from ancestral creators that travel across the country telling dreaming stories. But country is not just a place, it is a way of seeing and being in the world. Just a few key aspects of country. Humans are within the world, not taking a view outside of it, but holding a perspective within webs of connection. And this is what I mean by life being on the inside of country. In country, nature and culture are not separated, but entangled in multiple ways. And these are connections that might be strong, weak, distant or close, and so on. There are innate ties between land, law, language, different species, landscape features and so on in these connections. And in this world, humans are not the only people with agency. There are multiple more than human others that also have the capacity to act and to communicate. Across multi-species relationships, there are solidarities and obligations that are known and expressed that provide an ethos for being in country and for supporting relationships that sustain life. The traditional owners have talked about this as being connected, and I describe this as connectivity thinking, building on an expanded connectivity from what the ecologists talk about to bring in culture and law and language and so on, history, economy, etc. And this cosmological perspective is shared by many Indigenous people around the world. And I quite like the work of David Anderson, who's collaborated with the Evenkai reindeer herders in the harsh landscapes of Siberia, where he describes a sentient ecology embedded in communicative relationships. As he writes, hunters were aware that they came to know the animals in the land, and so too did the animals in the land come to know the hunter. So these are iterative, communicative, sentient relationships that are also life-sustaining. This is the Barmamilwa forest. It's the heartland of Yorta Yorta country. And Yorta Yorta people such as Lee Joachim, Monica Morgan and Uncle Henry Atkinson have spoken to me about the Barmamilwa lakes, which are actually on the Murray River. They are the kidneys of their people. And when the flooding regimes come through the kidneys, it cleanses the land and supports all forms of life in country. This is a knowledge framework focused on life-sustaining connections between all sorts of humans and more than human others, mixing up human bodies with lakes in regenerative, intimate, life-sustaining relationships. There are also responsibilities here. And Lee Joachim talks about how we must listen to the river country as part of understanding and river health. Because as Debbie Rose has said, to hear is to witness is to become entangled. And once we can understand that our lives are held in the hands of other beings and vice versa, we have the groundwork for building ethical obligations between species and between all sorts of life forms. And I remember distinctly the moment when I finally got what the traditional owners were saying when they would say to me, the river is life. And when they'd talk about country. And then I understood that my life too is also on the inside of country. And it was quite remarkable to become aware of the lively world that I'm in and that supports my life as I support others. Not always though. So this is Lee Joachim with some of his kids standing outside a huge scar tree. A canoe was taken from that tree. That's just outside the Yorta Yorta offices. And here's some pictures from the olden days of Aboriginal people going canoeing and spearing fish on the Murray River. So I've presented two different knowledge practices very briefly and a little bit separately, but of course everyone's living in the same space and meeting at intercultural negotiation tables. So I want to get into that in a moment, but I've got one more really influential binary to discuss, which is the tradition change binary. As geographer Bruce Braun has written, Indigenous people have to be both distant in time and space if they are to be regarded as authentically Indigenous. and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins has written that theories about hierarchical civilizations expect or anticipate that Indigenous peoples' traditional culture must be given up as part of their move towards a higher state of civilization, or from custom to rationality as part of the theory of progressive reason. And in Australia we have a land rights system called native title. It's recognition of Indigenous customary land tenures. And Indigenous people, traditional owners must prove their traditional laws and customs, which have been maintained since colonisation, to have native title rights and interests recognised. And it's been a very, for some people it's been a really horrible process. For the Yorta Yorta, they had a native title trial in the 1990s, but the judge viewed that their activities they'd undertaken, such as commercial farming, and activities they were no longer undertaking, such as initiation ceremonies, pretty much meant they weren't traditional owners anymore and they'd abandoned their native title. In his judgment, Justice Olney determined that Yorta Yorta traditional laws and customs had been washed away by the tide of history, and this was a phrase he used repeatedly in his judgment. And this tide of history is an assertion of the absolute primacy of the colonial narrative, sterilising the violence of colonisation as a tidal movement of water. This is a really violent use of the tradition change binary. Again, I'll return to Val Plumwood, who's eloquently shown us how these sorts of dualistic narratives are used to assert power by dominant groups, whether that's over Indigenous people or over nature and so on. So I just want to, this is a table where I've summarised some of the different ways that caring for country gets thwarted in this dualistic knowledge system. So natural resource management gets to be modern, whereas caring for country is traditional. Natural resource management gets to be universal, caring for country gets characterised as local. One is rational, the other emotional. The other one gets characterised as technical, spiritual. Natural resource management is culturally neutral, while this is culturally specific, and indeed it's overemphasised. The culture of caring for country is overemphasised, whereas the cultural underpinnings of natural resources and natural resource management go unexamined. This, for the traditional owners, as political scientist James Tully has identified, this sort of universal framework that the traditional owners are presented with provides them with a false. They either have to opt in to the universal framework or opt out and be marginalised. And this is the Darling River, right out in some of the arid country. And we can see how all this plays out in the conversations and debates around cultural flows and an Indigenous water allocation. So in lobbying for greater recognition of their water rights and issues, traditional owners in Southeast Australia have developed strategies and theories around cultural flows and have also talked about an Indigenous water allocation. Cultural flows strategically follows on from the language of environmental flows. You remember those tubes I showed you from before, the environmental works to get some water out on country. So we've got environmental flows, now we've got cultural flows. Environmental flows are what ecologists and others have long been arguing for to restore river health. So what are cultural flows? Well, a minimal definition is that they are a way of returning water to the river country as envisioned by the traditional owners. So to build on that, they are to recharge and revitalise the webs of connectivity that I talked about earlier, but from the perspective on country, so it's a much more expanded connectivity. So for example, environmental will water an ecologically important wetland, But a cultural flow might water a wetland where important grasses for basket weaving grow in a place that's quite accessible. So there's indicators there for Indigenous people that are not going to be come up in the ecological indicators for environmental flows. Environmental flows are also blind to country. So an environmental flow will not know whether it's watering muddy country or yorta country. So you cannot rely on an environmental flow to water your country because it doesn't include a broader sense of values. Because a lot of people say, but we've got environmental flows, so why do we have to worry about cultural flows? But you can't rely on them. And the other thing about environmental flows is there's only so much water for environmental flows, so they can't do everything. So in keeping with the viewpoint of country, cultural flows are often articulated by traditional owners as a flow of water that includes diverse values, spiritual, social, environmental, economic, and so on. And Yorta elder Uncle Henry Atkinson has said that cultural flows are a natural flow which allows everything to grow. Cultural flows include your history and your culture. So you can see here how he mixes, again, is mixing up the binaries. But unfortunately, the use of the word culture is a double-edged sword for Indigenous people. They gain a seat at the table because of their unique cultural identity, but by adopting the term culture, they run the risk of reducing their legal and political rights to narrowly defined cultural activities. Another key problem with cultural flows is how to interpret philosophy about country into an amount of water that can be recognised as an Indigenous water allocation and that can be lobbied for and realised so that you can undertake specific activities on country, including economic activities. Yet if traditional owners are arguing for an Indigenous water allocation, they reduce their language of country to pursuing a slice of the water pie, or just pursuing another water allocation. And so the traditional owners get caught up in contradictory binds when translating their meaning and rights into the dualistic knowledge traditions that dominate water management. And no doubt, environmentalists have also had to face strategic compromises with environmental water allocations. Because this is also a thinking that posits the river as just another consumer of river water and not the source of the water. And we see the negative effects of this type of thinking when in times of water stress, environmental water allocations are often the first to go. So more needs to be done than just adding the environment to the list of water users in our water reform processes. What is crucial to know about cultural flows is that there is no cultural flow from a dead river. That cultural flows are about restoring water to the river country, as I talked before. The bigger message of country, because there will never be enough water allocations for cultural flows to make a real difference, to make a significant difference. And so the traditional owners must speak out about cultural flows to evoke an Australian water ethic that is more sustainable. And that is why they keep returning to country and the message that the river is life in their water management discussions. And their capacity to evocatively identify and connect diverse values to water flows is a really powerful contribution to our water management practice in Australia. Because without being able to express and make relevant these connections, environmental reform efforts can go to waste. And we saw this, we saw this a few years ago. I think it was 2010, an ambitious large-scale water reform plan for the Murray-Darling Basin was launched. It was the largest environmental water reform plan ever undertaken, I think, in the world. It's huge plan to return water to the river country, coming right at the end of the drought. And it was burnt by angry communities and individuals and companies concerned about the loss of water allocations for irrigation livelihoods. There were protests across the Murray-Darling Basin whenever the authorities went out to speak to communities about the plan. It was very badly handled as well, I've got to say, and there's been a lot of work done on that, on how they communicated the plan and how the media strategy was handled as well. But one of the things of relevant to this discussion today is how the plan and its release was steeped in the language of ecology and environment and science, and failed to connect river industries with the primacy of river health. It failed to show that we cannot have river industries without a river, without a living river, and to show that hierarchy, that the river comes first. If you've got a healthy river connectivity, then you can support all these other values. A scaled down version of the plan has now been signed off, but yes, it was half as ambitious. This is the Edward River in Wamba Wamba country. The issues the traditional owners bring to natural resource management and water management are not simply about competing vested interests in shared spaces, but a sign of deep ontological and cosmological schisms, and the failure of universal approaches such as natural resource management to be universal. Indeed, they never were. Further, as water academic Margriet Zwartieven argues, the complexity of today's water problems requires contributions from diverse knowers and their knowledges. The point of my discussion today is not to set up an either-or option between Indigenous and so-called universal knowledges, but to bring diverse knowledges together to build the best outcome for country. We just need to peg the authority of universal knowledge, which is incredibly the scientific tradition, the technical managerial skills, and recognise it as one source of knowledge in a world where we can only ever have partial objectivity. And we need to listen and consider what the assumptions might be behind all our different knowledges, so that we can communicate in the intercultural space and look for opportunities to collaborate. Find those sticky universals, as ethnographer Anna Singh writes, that connect across diverse cultures, bringing different knowledges together towards common goals. Of course, water is a resource for human consumption, but it is also so much more than that. The loss of variable freshwater flows in the inland river countries, it's not just the loss of one participant in the webs that connect life, but the loss of a key connecting life force. When the rain comes and soaks into the dry earth, and then water runs off into creeks, streams and rivers, the flooding rivers spread fertile nutrients over the land. Kangaroos, emus, dingoes, birds and bats move large distances. Koalas seek local refuge in trees and on higher ground. Snakes take advantage of the mice and lizards marooned by floodwaters and are able to raise extra young at this time. And if we have very heavy rainfall and prolonged floodwaters, the burrowing giant banjo frog will emerge from underneath the hardened clay. After the floods, small aquatic animals flourish and breeding water birds feed on the fresh food. With receding floodwaters, plants send up shoots, set fruit and seed, and all mammals, humans included, are attracted to the feed. Floodwaters celebrate and sustain life, and this is what we lose when we transform complex freshwater ecologies into channels that deliver a regulated muddy flow of water for consumptive use. Never has it been more important to get this right than today, when we have the last elders, and several of the people I've spoken about today have passed away, but we still have some of the last elders, Indigenous, the traditional owners, as well as elders from other cultures that knew what came before, that knew that the rivers used to run clear, because my generation just thinks that rivers are muddy. And we also have the new challenges of rapid shifts in the climate. We must look to our relationships with rivers to understand ourselves and how to make a pathway out of this catastrophe. Thank you for listening.